DC voters, I'm Lisa Rice, native Washingtonian, proposer of Ballot Initiative 83. Let's make politicians work harder with 2 changes to our system. 1, let independents like me vote in taxpayer-funded primary elections. And 2, implement ranked choice voting to vote for your favorite candidate and rank your backup choices. Candidates need over 50% to win. Flip your ballot and vote yes on 83. Paid for by Make All Votes Count DC, Philip Pinnell, Treasurer.
Today on CityCast DC, Tony Lewis Jr. was 9 years old when his father was arrested. The trial that followed was a huge deal in DC. Tony Sr. had been part of the operation of the notorious 1980s drug kingpin Rayful Edmond. Their trial was so explosive that the jury was hidden behind glass. What happened to Tony Jr. got a lot less attention. Over the years, he became an activist against violence in D.C. and against the kinds of sentences that got his dad sent away for life. Last year, after a campaign spearheaded by Tony Jr., his father walked free. He's here to tell us about how it all went down and what he thinks D.C. needs to do for people coming out of prison. Today is Thursday, October 10th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what D.C. is talking about. Hey, Tony, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike. I appreciate it.
So your story is, it's a super interesting one because it feels like, you're at the center of a Victorian novel about the history of D.C.
Yeah.
For people who haven't read Slug, and you should, what neighborhood did you grow up in? What was it like?
Yeah, so I grew up on Hanover Place, which is pretty much at the intersection of North Capitol and New York Avenue in Northwest Washington, D.C. I was born in 1980. So at that time, my block was regarded as sort of the epicenter of the cocaine trade. And so all that kind of came along with that. That's sort of the world that I was born into. My family, my father, his friends, so on and so forth, was active in the drug trade. And so, but that community was also filled with a ton of love and support for a kid like me. And, I remained here for the duration of my life pretty much.
You also, though, your dad was really successful and you all moved to,
Sure.
You sort of got to live the high life.
Yeah, we certainly, my dad was incredibly successful as a drug dealer, and that allowed for us to move to the suburbs. The interesting piece of that, though, like for us, it obviously was away from here in terms of where we slept, but we still spent so much of our time here. And I often reflect on the moments, the warmth, the comfort of our home out in Largo, Maryland. I remember it, the first 9 years of my life, basically. But so much of the suburban experience I also didn't really have, because, our life was just so not like, my parents went to work and came home type of thing. But I went to Catholic school, and I went to school in Maryland. And I would, I remember just talking to a lot of my friends about what their lives were like after school. And our life was so much different. But I did have that. And I'm the only child, and I had a doting mother and father up until my dad's incarceration, which happened in 1989. And shortly after that, we were moved back here, and been here ever since.
So you've talked about, what it was like. You flew out to Las Vegas to watch fights.
Yeah.
Your dad wanted you to dress really well.
Yeah, I had a lot of exposure, man. Also, can't forget the Super Bowl or the Redskins. That's those kind of things.
So when did you become aware of what your dad was doing?
You know what, man? That's a good question. It's one of them things where, I didn't think my dad had a job, but you got to think my dad was not any different from any of the other men that I knew in my life, right? So to me, it was like, people being involved in the lifestyle. That's all we knew. So I think even before I had an awareness of what like being a drug dealer was, right? I knew what it was without knowing what it was, right? Or somebody that robbed banks or somebody that gambled or whatever the case may be. Those were all my influences. But by the time you go to prison at 9 and into my early teens, of course, I'm like more aware of the world, and I know, that my father, was a drug dealer. Yeah.
So when your dad got arrested, and it was huge news in DC.
Yeah.
I'm just a few years older than you. I
All
remember I was in
right.
high school,
And it was everywhere.
and there was a trial. Your dad worked with Rayful Edmond, who was the sort
Correct.
of most famous drug kingpin in DC, and the feds, they laid out this case against them that was one of these, like, I mean, obviously lots of people were scared. They had to put the jury behind glass.
Yeah.
But the prosecutor's case was laid out sort of such a brilliant business that there were a lot of people at the time writing articles of, there, but for the circumstances of his birth. He could have been a Fortune 500 CEO. This is what they were doing was such successful
Mhm.
business. Can you talk a little bit about the scene around Rayful Edmond in the 80s?
Yeah, in a way, but I mean, I can more talk about seeing around my dad. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, him and my dad were friends, right? He was somebody that I saw as being like an uncle, So those guys had a level of fame, particularly in communities like the one we were from, where people just wanted to be in their presence. I saw them give a lot, and I don't say that to slant or to, but I think people have layers, and sometimes if you're known for one thing, that the other parts of you aren't talked about enough. And what I've been regarded as one of the leading, sort of servants in our city, a lot of that was influenced by what I saw in those days, where they would give people money and support youth football teams and support folks that were, struggling or couldn't pay their bills, those kind of things. But it was always in my presence, as a young man or as a boy, a lot of respect and admiration, a lot of smiles, a lot of laughter. And, as they went about doing their business, I think they were able to positively impact folks while they were negatively impacting folks, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But that's what the scene sort of was, for sure.
So you're 9 years old, and all of a sudden, everything changes.
Yeah.
Your dad is put on trial. They had to hold them in Quantico and helicopter them up to DC.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he, goes away. Your life changes dramatically. What was it like?
It was the most traumatic experience that, one could imagine, and, shortly after that, and even in the midst of that, I sort of lost my mom in the way that I had her before. The stress and the pressure and the trauma of that situation really broke her, And so here I am, a young man who had two loving parents, and now my father's doing life without parole, and now my mother's battling severe mental illness, And at a time where we didn't have the words and we didn't have the support, a lot of the support that I've tried to work to ensure that children with incarcerated parents receive today, I didn't have any of that. And not to mention, this is the time of the crack era, a time where DC is pretty much, the worst place in America, honestly. And that's the world that I lived in and had to grow in. And it was terrible, man. And to add to that, my father also got shipped 3,000 miles away to a place called Lompoc, California, where he will remain for the next 13 years. So it really was one of the most trying, challenging times of my life.
You would speak with him every day when he was
Yeah,
incarcerated.
unless they were like locked down or something, which that did happen. But for the most part, we had some form of communication daily.
And in the intervening years, you went to high school at Gonzaga, a
I did.
very rigorous and prestigious Catholic school. And you studied about, you learned a bunch about the history of this period at UDC. And it gave you some perspective on, both the places that your dad did terrible things to the community, but also, the question of whether being sent away without parole is proportionate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, one of the things about where I come from, the culture that I was raised in, we actually, believe it or not, believe in accountability. Like, and so I never was like, my dad wasn't a political prisoner. I was never like naive to, my father was a drug dealer, right? But his context to his decisions and decisions of a lot of people like him and my peers, we come from a place where nobody make it. And that's why every day I wake up feeling like the luckiest man alive, because it's not simply about choice when you come from a place where the choices are bad and worse and not necessarily good and bad. And that's not an excuse. That's the reality. And so what I've tried to be is a beacon of hope. And through his advice, his example, his tutelage, he's causal in a lot of my, how I made it through. how I was able to navigate. He didn't have a him, right? He didn't have a positive male role model or just a dad in general. He don't even know what his dad is. So that does matter in the mind of a young man and the choices that they make. And that's for my dad in the late 70s. And that's for a young man in Washington, D.C. right now. You know what I mean? A school alone can't save these children or some program. Like, they need the adults in their lives to have an opportunity to stabilize.
This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. When I think about October, I think about masks. And no, not the face masks we all wore during the pandemic. I think about Halloween and wearing costumes. For parties, it's all in good fun, but for some of us, this feeling of wearing a mask in our daily lives, pretending to be somebody else, is constant, and it can be draining. That's why talking to a professional who can help is so important. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp makes it easier than ever to take this first step. It's all online. You just fill out a quick questionnaire to be matched with a licensed therapist, and then you design your own plan based around your schedule. And if you ever want to change your therapist at any time, you can, for no extra charge. Take off the mask with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/citycast today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/citycast.
34 years after your dad is sent away, in 2023, he's released. And the release comes thanks largely to a grassroots effort led by you. And, and I think this experience, you've obviously written about it in book form, this experience of being a kid who has to deal with it. When your father goes away, everything changes. I think really informed and motivated a lot of your outlook on the world. Can you explain the sort of coming into that consciousness that made you feel like you ought to take this in your hands?
Yeah, just when I was about 20, Mike, just finding my way, my purpose of being able to serve my community, initially from the standpoint of violence interruption, and then starting to work in the reentry space. So as I was serving and helping people that came from communities like mine, I kind of, saw more clearly that I had the ability to not only help my father, but to help so many other people like us. And it really was not just solely motivated about his freedom, but for bringing justice and economic opportunity to my community. And as my platform grew in that, I saw that nobody else was coming to help. And I knew that my dad did not deserve to go to prison. I always maintained that my dad broke the law and he should have been held accountable, but that his sentence really did not, in my opinion, measure up to his crime. Like, I didn't believe he deserved life without parole. And so as I fought around local and national campaigns, around things like the 2-point reduction and the Fair Sentencing Act, and then ultimately the First Step Act that would free my dad, I wouldn't stop. I felt like as I grew and as I matured, as I helped more people, and I saw so many people benefit from my efforts, I was like, my dad should benefit from them as well. And then not to mention the work that he and I would start to collaborate on while he was incarcerated, to help men and women that were returning, to be able to positively influence a lot of the violence or some of the violence that was going on in the community. I saw it, fit that my dad be returned to us. And, I'm very thankful that after 34 years, March 20th, 2023, that my dream, my prayers were answered and he was freed.
So how old were you when your dad got out?
Oh, I was 43.
And how old was he?
He was 61.
So you've seen DC change a lot over your life, right?
Yeah.
And you've seen a lot of different DCs. You went
Absolutely.
to Gonzaga, you lived on Hanover Place, you lived in Largo. Your dad comes back to this very different city. What kind of change does he notice that you might, because we're all like, like frogs in the pot and the pot's getting hotter.
Yeah.
What'd your dad notice after having been away?
Everything. Think about it. 34 years. And I say this with all no disrespect, and I hope people understand what I'm saying. We live on Hanover Place, man. We have white neighbors, bro. Like, you would never, ever have white neighbors on Hanover Place. You know what I'm saying? Or in the surrounding blocks. This was a nearly 100% African-American neighborhood for 10 blocks north, south, east, and west. And now it's almost, it's totally different. all of the infrastructure, all of the buildings, everything's different. The bus routes, the street names, to a certain degree, not all the streets, just a lot of streets are the same, but what they look like are different. And even some of the neighborhood names, like everything is different. But in some ways, because my father, unlike so many returning citizens, was able to come home to stability, right? Come home and have time to learn and grow and familiarize himself with what's going on. He didn't come home and was like on the clock and had to be the breadwinner and had to take care of people. You know what I mean? So we were blessed in that way. But I want people to understand that most people that are returning from incarceration, whether they were gone 34 years, 34 weeks, or 34 months, they aren't coming home to that stability. And they're coming home to communities that once were and now is a bygone era. And they don't have the social capital. They're the people that they know are no longer the neighbors. And that really is cumbersome, that is arduous, that is difficult for them. That has mental health impacts. And not to mention, for specifically, we're talking about like DC. DC residents are doing their time in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. They're all over America. They're not being prepared to re-enter here in the district. So there's so many elements to why re-entry and family reunification can be negatively impacted, and people find themselves in a situation where they may reoffend or they may relapse just because there's not enough stability. And so my dad's experience in reentry has been, just like his life in general, has been incredibly unique. But I am grateful that, we are in a position where my family, we provide that support. But now we're a year and a half in. He's been working pretty much since he came home. He
What's
has
he
his
doing?
legs under him. He's doing construction management, just growing and learning in that field every day.
Was it hard to talk his way into that job? I mean, I presume a lot of people would say, like, we don't want anything to do with you, given your past.
Yeah. I mean, in most cases, but again, the person that everybody, leans on in this space is his son, right? So because of, my relationships and I think people's regard for him, it wasn't as difficult as it is for a lot of the people that I work with every day, if that makes sense, And also my dad is an incredibly intelligent, bright person, somebody who, just when you're in this space, he's a likable guy. And I think all of that play a role in his ability to not only get employed, but to stay employed over this time since he's been home. His dedication to, it's his first job. That's another thing. I mean, him just wanting to prove, I think, to the community, all the people that helped stand up for him, with me. And I think to himself, man, that he can do this normal life thing. And I think he's been doing a tremendous job at that.
So one thing I got to ask you about, there's, right now a political scandal going on in D.C. following the arrest of Councilmember Trayon White on bribery charges. And one of the things that has come out of that, because some of the alleged bribes involved contracts for violence intervention programs. And there's people saying, these programs are no good. We should shut them down. What do you make of those calls?
Yeah, I think that's incredibly egregious. I think it's disrespectful to the violence interrupters, the people that I consider to be first responders, the people that I know for a fact are saving lives every day, people that are going into the most difficult terrain with no weaponry, no gun, no vest, just their commitment and their reputation. And I know personally that people are, in fact, saving lives. And then when we talk about a 35% drop in homicides in our city, and if anybody out there think that that's caused solely by MPD or law enforcement or Security DC, I'm not saying that those entities don't play a role, because they do. But you better know that the violence interrupters play a significant role in that drop. And I think that it's disrespectful for the police union to even insinuate that all these programs, and if we're talking about an isolated incident that had nothing to do with the frontline workers, for that to put a black eye. I mean, you have bankers, you have banking scandals. Do we talk about closing all banks? You've had 2 MPD officers be sentenced in the last 60 days for playing a role in people's deaths. And we also had an MPD officer to be charged with molesting or sexual assault on a juvenile. Is the police union saying we should halt the police budget? No, you wouldn't dare do that, right? And so to me, that's ridiculous. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely. There's room for improvement in every industry and in every facet. But for somebody that's not, or people that aren't even equipped or well versed in the work to even make that sort of recommendation, to me, it just speaks to the lack of respect that people have, not only for the work, but more importantly, for the people that do the work. And most of the people that do that work are formerly incarcerated people. 99% of them are Black people. So these are the things, these microaggressions that we see. And if I have anything to do with it, I'm not standing for that. I'm not allowing that. Mike, they may make $50,000 a year. They don't even make a livable wage, but people they've hurt the community in the past, and they want to show that this community, that they are changed, that they've grown, and they here to save lives and stop people from going down the road that they went down. And like, again, man, for people to even make those sort of recommendations and for people to listen to it, to me is a scary thing.
Do you think it might have been different in the 80s in DC if this kind of program had existed in a bigger way?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. But what I know would have helped in the 80s, the 90s, early 2000s, and even right now, if we can't do a better job of creating pathways to economic development for poor communities, it's going to be very difficult for us to truly get to where we want to go, right? Poverty is the main primary driver. We need to do things like record sealing for those that have been formerly incarcerated. We need the private sector here in DC to do a better job of hiring local, right? There is so much economic development going on here that people that are from here have not been able to attach to, right? We can train people up. We can do the things necessary to get people ready, but the opportunity has to be there. And I think that's going to be the best and most sustainable violence intervention plan that we can do, right? If you think about it, Mike, this is really mainly an issue that is impacting Black people from Washington, D.C. I'm saying there's no diversity in any of this. There's no diversity in the victimology. There's no diversity in the perpetrator. There's no diversity in those that are unemployed. There's no diversity in those that are housing insecure. There's no diversity in those that are food insecure. When we really think about it, it's one group of people. So if the broader populace doesn't understand how this plays itself out, in everyday life, and a deposit into this population, I feel is a deposit in every Washingtonian, right? Because if people can stabilize, it just makes the city better for all of us.
So tell me, what's one thing you want people to take away from the story of you and your dad?
First of all, that's the one thing I think that's the most important, is that, you don't quit your family. You know what I'm saying? And that people have layers, people make mistakes, but sometimes people's mistakes aren't a fair representation of them in their totality. My dad is a beautiful guy. My dad made a bad choice in the past that we all were impacted by. But at the same time, so many of the qualities and the person that I've become is directly, I'm off his tree. And hopefully the things that I've been able to contribute to this city and to this country at this point, people can see it as a reflection on him as well.
I thought one of the most touching things about his story was how when he's looking for release, he cites you as an example of the good he can be.
Yeah, man. That touched me too, That touched me, man. And he's a great granddad too, man. Just to see this guy around here, man, taking my daughters to Target and, attending all the activities. And just watching that for me is just a beautiful thing because, again, so much of that was interrupted with me. You know what I'm saying? And yeah, man, we live in a dream. And again, I'll just to Washington, D.C. We're just grateful that, not only did you got a lot of people support his return, but just being so gracious when we've seen people, out in the community. It's just really been a beautiful thing, man,
Tony, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for sharing your story.
Mike, good to see you. Thank you.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.